Hey guys, we are finally beginning coverage of the new season for Hell's Kitchen, that being head chefs only, and we'll be coming at you with a power ranking every single chef in the game right now based on how likely they are to win the game. Now, obviously, we're only one episode in, and we haven't really seen too much of these chefs' abilities so far outside of their signature dish, and we had got some glimpses into their personalities that I'm sure will be playing out more as the season goes along. But I still think we have enough information to essentially treat this as a preseason power ranking. Considering that I usually do that for other shows, I feel like for Hell's Kitchen in particular, I couldn't really do that considering how little information we had about these people. But now that we actually have a full episode to break down here, I feel like we can talk a bit more about these people. Now, kind of similar to how I cover other edited shows like Survivor and The Amazing Race, I try to factor in the edit as much as I can, as I feel like that's probably the most indicative of where people are going. And while Hell's Kitchen doesn't have the most robust editing trends in the world compared to Survivor, that's still going to be my main criteria here, although we'll also be discussing how these people did in the actual challenges here. And I guess I should also clarify for people new to the channel that this ranking is not necessarily a boot list. I'm not going to be ranking these people based on who I think is going to be the first boot per se, even though I think some of the people towards the bottom are unlikely to win. I feel like this is more so how much potential I feel like these people have to actually win the game if they're able to make a deep run and based off the content that they've gotten up to this point. But with all that out of the way, we have 18 people to talk about, and let's waste some more time. Let's get right into the video. So starting off at number 18, the person I believe is the least likely to win from this point on is Brandon. And I should say that for these bottom couple of people, these are essentially the people that got minimal content across the premiere or very surface level content, as I feel like the premiere is normally a way to introduce us to these people and to really set up their storylines moving forward. But I feel like Brandon's probably the person that I know the least about, where I feel like the only memorable moment from him is when sous chef James is introduced and talking about how like he's really cool and that he's glad to be working with him. But beyond that, I mean, Brandon does pretty well in the signature dish challenge. He does get 5 points there, which at least is something. That's at least something to give him. But I feel like the edit is just not giving him any favors. I feel like I know almost nothing about him, and I feel like he's probably the least likely to win because of that. Now, again, he will probably be a competent chef considering how well he did in the challenge. But I feel like with the fact that he didn't really get much to do in this premiere, I feel like I don't really have enough confidence to say that he'll actually win by the end of it, even though I feel like he could have some longevity in him. But I feel like with the lack of content, I do have him here at number 18. Now moving on to number 17, we have another person who I don't really get the greatest sense from them, but we do have Corbin. Now, the thing about Corbin is we did get a bit more from him across the premiere, where he's got to talk during the signature dish challenge about how his mom like raised him, how she was a single mom, and that they had a rough upbringing. But really outside of that, he doesn't get much to do either. I feel like most of his content comes during when he's talking to Ramsey during the signature dish challenge. Now again, he does fine enough. He ends up getting 4 points here, but again, doesn't really stand out here. And I've been hearing some talk online about how he is rumored to be an early boot here, so I think that's also factoring into his ranking. But I feel like with the fact that we didn't get much from Corbin, where he literally doesn't get a single confessional until the punishment after the challenge, was enough to have him towards the bottom at number 17. Now moving on to number 16, we have another person who I found pretty bland across the premiere, but we do have Magali. And Magali's another one who did pretty well in the signature dish challenge, getting 5 points there, but she's another one that I don't know much about her, where I feel like a lot of her content is pretty surface level, talking about how she can't believe she's on the show and how having dinner with Ramsey as part of the reward is pretty good. I feel like I don't really get much from Magali, and I feel like with the lack of characterization there, I do have her here towards the bottom again at number 16. Now moving on to number 15, and we have someone who had a bit more to do across the premiere, but I feel like the show's not really propping them up all that much. But at number 15, we do have Yuri, and again, Yuri got a bigger edit here. He is clearly being set up to be a pretty big character, at least for the early parts of the season, but he's already being undermined here, where you have him during the signature dish challenge, like calling out Joe for like what he's doing in preparing the dish, and Joe gets to call him out there. But obviously the bigger component comes during the punishment, where he decides to just do inventory and like we have a whole bunch of people calling him out for that as well, saying he's not pulling his weight. And again, the fact that he's already getting negativity in the premiere is not particularly great, and he kind of stands out as being one of the only people to truly get negative content across the premiere and kind of being set up as someone that can cause a lot of conflict here, or even his positive content where he's talking to Ramsey about how he's an immigrant coming from Buenos Aires. Like, you even have Ramsey joking about how the American dream was last season. So again, I feel like Yuri is someone who's definitely going to be a bigger character than the people we already talked about, but the fact that he's already getting negativity, the fact that people are already not liking him, and we're seeing that on the show, was enough to have him here at number 15. Now moving on to number 14, and we have another person who's also standing out, but not for the best reasons, but we do have Amber. And Amber's another one who also is standing out here as being the only person to not get a 4 or a 5 during the challenge, instead getting a 3, and a lot of it being centered around like the fact that her dish was based off her background growing up in the desert, talking about how she's used to growing elk and venison, only for Ramsey to talk about how she kind of brought down the dish because of that. So obviously that's not great. And again, I feel like the fact that Amber didn't do the best on the challenge here kind of makes her stand out here, where admittedly, I don't think it's a death nail for her, where I think the fact that we at least got some more personal content from her, like, points out that she could be a bigger character on the season despite this early setback. Not to mention the fact that I feel like the services will matter more into the actual performance across the season compared to just one challenge. But again, I feel like where a lot of the chefs did pretty well in the actual challenge, the fact that Amber was a step below them is something to call out here, mixing that in with that being tied to some of her personal content, talking about being from the desert, was not to have her in the bottom half here, though it wouldn't shock me if she were to go up in the future, but for now I do have her here at number 14. Now moving on to number 13, and we're kind of going back now to some of the more under the radar people who I found to be pretty unimpressive across their premieres, but at number 13 we do have Michael, and Michael's content felt entirely circumstantial, where a lot of it was about him leaving the lamb on the table during the challenge, and there was this whole question of, is he going to screw it up or not? And while he doesn't, I feel like that's pretty much all we get from him. And I feel like we know nothing about him personally. And admittedly, there's an argument for him being below Amber, where I feel like Amber at least has more room to turn around from a story standpoint, whereas I feel like we know pretty much nothing about Michael. And I feel like the only reason why Michael got the content that he did was because of the whole lamb situation and then trying to create drama for the actual challenge. But again, I feel like with Amber and Yuri having more blatant negatives to point out, whereas at least Michael was able to make the lamb thing work out, was enough to have him above them, though again, not looking at him as a contender, which is why he's here at number 13. Now moving on to number 12, and we have another person who didn't really stand out across the premiere, but got some content here and there, but we do have Amanda. And again, Amanda's just kind of there for the most part. I feel like the thing that jumped out to me the most from her edit was during the challenge, where she talked about how she's used to being the loudest one in the room, but now she doesn't know where to start, where again, we do learn a bit about her because of that, but outside of that, wasn't too impressed by her showing here. And while she does pretty well in the actual challenge, I feel like she's not really meant to be a big character on the season. It's just kind of there, which is why she's here at number 12. Now moving on to number 11, and we have another person who is also kind of there, but I feel like there's more things I can point out with them. But number 11, we do have Anne Marie. And again, Anne Marie is probably not the biggest character in the world, but I do think she kind of stands out for her signature dish, where she talks about how she wanted to emulate one of Gordon Ramsay's dishes, and we see that really working out here. And we also see her talking during the reward, talking about how it was cool to learn about Gordon Ramsay's backstory, about being a football player. So again, there's at least some things to call out here. The fact that she at least talks a lot about Gordon Ramsay, more than I can say about certain other people, but again, not a major character, not someone I'm really looking at the time being, which is why she's here at number 11. Now moving on to number 10, and this is a person that has potential to move up or down depending on how future episodes go. And while this person got a pretty big edit in this episode, I feel like a lot of it was kind of circumstantial. But at number 10, we do have Brittany. And Brittany's someone who obviously made a pretty big splash in the premiere, where a lot of content was about her getting injured during the challenge and her trying to make this dish that she uses to impress guys. There was a chance that she could have messed it up due to her getting blood on the pasta, but again is able to turn around by the end of it. So again, a lot of it did feel circumstantial simply due to her getting injured and it being a way to make the challenge more suspenseful in terms of the final score. But I think what puts her above someone like Michael, who also got similar content, is I feel like Brittany got a bit more propping up beyond that, where I feel like we got an introduction from her before like the whole signature dish stuff. And I feel like even afterwards, where she gets a lot of the credit for helping the women winning the challenge, even though she wasn't the final person to put up their dish, she still gets credit for doing so. And she also gets to talk afterwards about how like she is glad to be on a team full of women and that she feels uplifted and supported by them. So I feel like that's enough to have her above someone like Michael, who I feel like got pretty much nothing of substance beyond like the whole lamb situation. I feel like Brittany got a bit more that could make her like endearing to the audience, but I feel like beyond that, like I feel like there are other people who either got bigger presences across the premiere or people who got more unnecessary content than Brittany, which is why I do have her here around the middle of the list at number 10. Now moving on to number 9, and I feel like this top 9 is pretty secure in my eyes. I feel like these top 9 all have potential to be major characters on the season, and it all depends on how future weeks go. But at number 9, we have the person I am the most on the fence about at this current point, but at number 9, we do have Shant. And I think Shant got decent content here where he got to talk about the season's theme, talking about how it's head chefs only, so there's a lot of talent, but also a lot of egos. He also talked about his fiance and how she would appreciate the prize money for their wedding, which is something to point out here. And again, does pretty well in the first challenge here. Now, again, I feel like compared to the top 8, I feel like Shank definitely could have gotten more, but at the same time, I feel like I really like how he got to talk about the season's theme. But until I see more from him, I'm gonna have to leave him here at number 9. Now moving on to number 8, and we have another person who definitely left a stronger impression across the premiere, though I question as well whether this person is truly leading up to a win. But number 8, we do have Joe, and I think Joe's another one who kind of stands out, where he got a lot to do across his premiere, where he talks about how winning the money will be a life changer for his family, getting some decent personal content there. But I feel like the bigger thing to talk about is the setup to his rivalry with Yuri, where we see Yuri calling him out during the signature dish challenge, saying that Joe's not doing it right, but Joe's able to come out on top there. And then during the punishment, we also have Joe being one of the bigger voices and calling out Yuri for not really doing much. So I feel like we are getting this rivalry here between Joe and Yuri. And while the show is showing Joe as being in the right, where Joe is shown like the one taking things more seriously, the one who's working harder, and the one kind of proving Yuri wrong, I also question whether this is going to lead to a win or not, or whether this is just the reason why there's so much content to create this foil for Yuri. But I feel like considering that Joe is meant to be shown in the right, being a bit more positive, and someone who has gotten a bit more to do across this premiere, I do have him significantly above Yuri, but I feel like I have enough questions over whether his content will be about himself versus just him being opposed to Yuri. That makes me a bit more questionable over whether he'll actually do well or whether the bulk of his content will be around Yuri. But I feel like for now, I do have him here around number 8. Now moving on to number 7, and we have another person who made a pretty strong impression across the premiere, but we do have Kyle. And Kyle's been getting pretty interesting setup to them doing particularly well here, where obviously they stand out rather bad for them wearing this pink zebra outfit. And we talk about Kyle wanting to use that to allow people to underestimate him, which is all pretty good there. And then we see him doing somewhat well across the signature dish challenge. So I feel like Kyle's definitely going to be one of the more rootable people across the season based on what we've seen so far. And I feel like he got decent setup to him being like this underdog, someone that people tend to underestimate, but performs pretty well. So I feel like that's a big reason why he is in the top half of the list. But at the same time, the reason I don't have him higher is I feel like he's definitely someone who has a lot of potential to be a big character on the season, someone who's meant to be this underdog, but someone who maybe gets deep into the game but comes up short by the end of it. So I feel like that alone is a big reason why he's not higher, but I feel like so far, I feel like he's got pretty decent setup to him doing well across the season, which is why he's here at number 7. Now moving on to number 6, and we have another person who I expect to be a pretty rootable presence across the season, though I question whether Gordon Ramsay will actually reward them with the win or not. But number 6, we do have Wit, and Wit obviously got a pretty decent premiere as well, where they get decent setup to a storyline, talking about how a lot of their confidence comes from grinding, how they want to prove that hard work can lead to success. And they really want to disprove a lot of people that doubted them. And we see them doing pretty well across the Signature Dish Challenge, getting a perfect score there. And that's immediately followed up by a confessional of them talking about how that's on the beginning, how they're here to blow Gordon Ramsay's mind. So again, I feel like Wick got a pretty decent premiere here, and I feel like they are being set up to be a pretty big character across the season. Though again, a part of me does question how obvious it'll be and whether Ramsay will actually like see Wit as being the head chef of a restaurant. But I feel like again, this was a pretty decent premiere for them, and I feel like that confessional after their signature dish is a pretty good setup for them doing pretty well across the season, which is why they're here towards the top of the list at number 6. Now moving on to number 5, and this is a person who I wasn't really looking at initially, and I felt like a lot of their episodes was just kind of whatever, but they do have a pretty decent scene towards the end that makes me feel like they're going to do pretty well, and that is Lulu. And admittedly, a lot of Lulu's episode here is pretty unremarkable, where they get pretty baseline content about like the intro and how they're getting a welcome by the Coast Guard of all people. And we see them like doing pretty well in the signature dish. And I feel like that alone is not really enough to have her this high on the list. And I feel like if her edit was just that, then she'd probably be like towards the bottom half of the list. But I think the main thing that propels Lulu this high on the list is one of the last scenes in the episode, right before the cliffhanger, where we get this really random conversation between Lulu and Anne Marie, where Lulu's talking about how she worked hard to get to the top, how she like worked 6 days a week, how she wants to win, and that win or not, she's gonna get to that level. And the fact that they bothered to include that conversation feels pretty random and unnecessary. Like they easily could have cut that out, but I feel like the fact that they kept it in makes me feel like Lulu could be important to the season. Now, granted, she doesn't really get a confessional to explain her backstory more, but I feel like that could also help her as well, considering they're trying to not make it too obvious, that they're just trying to slip this in right before like this really dramatic scene. And considering that it happens immediately after this conversation between Anthony and Egypt, which is obviously a dynamic that was already set up in other scenes, the fact that they just slip in this little conversation makes me open my eyes a little bit. And again, while it could just be nothing, I mean, the fact that Lulu still got this content regardless makes me think that she could do pretty well here. Now, obviously, I could be proven wrong, but again, I feel like that scene alone is enough to have her this high on the list at number 5. Now moving on to number 4, and we are essentially now at the top tier of the list, and it's just a matter of ordering them. But number 4, we have someone who I'm feeling pretty good about after the premiere, both from an edit and from a performance standpoint, but we do have Hannah. And Hannah definitely stands out here, getting pretty solid content to start, where at the beginning of the episode, she gets to talk about how she's similar to Michelle and that she's small and mighty and that they'll show their teeth when they're needed. And again, kind of similar content to Brandon, but I feel like Hannah gets significantly more than that, where later on during the Signature Dish Challenge, she talks about her approach, talking about how she likes to take these polar opposites and making them work. And that's followed up working out pretty well by her getting a perfect score of a 5. And she ends up winning the challenge for her team. But even beyond that, you have her getting another confessional on the reward where they're at the Hell's Kitchen restaurant. She talks about how she imagines herself running that restaurant. So again, I feel like this was a pretty solid episode for Hannah on the whole. Now, you could definitely chalk a lot of it up to circumstance, where obviously she is the person that wins the challenge for her team, though at the same time, Brittany also got shared credit for that on the show, but whatever. But I feel like the Michelle content at the beginning as well is also pretty good, and that additional confessional about imagining herself running the restaurant could be a decent winner quote for her. So I feel like Hannah got a pretty solid premiere, and while it's just episode 1 and you could chalk a lot of it up to circumstance, I feel like until I'm proven wrong, I feel like Hannah's someone who I'm looking at pretty highly, which is why she's here at number 4. Now moving on to number 3, and admittedly, I did consider whether this person was too high or not, but I feel like this person got good enough content to where they could be a contender, mixing that in with her actual ability. But number 3, we do have Megan. And I feel like this was a good enough episode for Megan here, where she obviously does pretty well in this Signature Dish Challenge, being one of the 5s. And we get her main personal content afterwards, where she talks about how she came toe-to-toe with people who doubted her, and that representing her home of Hawaii is all pretty good, which, again, is not much. I mean, and you could definitely chalk a lot of it up to the fact that she got a 5, but I still feel like it was a good enough introduction for her. It's good enough to where we can see the storyline about her being underestimated. And while I don't think she got the biggest edit in the world, and I could definitely see her going down in the future, I feel like it was just enough to where we got set up to her, we got a proper introduction to her without her being completely overexposed, that I decided to rank her pretty highly, though we'll have to see how future weeks play out. But for now, I do have her here at number 3. Now moving on to number 2, and spoiler alert, the top 2 are both on the blue team, and it's just a matter of ordering them. And I feel like these two got pretty solid premieres, definitely people I am expecting to do well moving forward. But number 2, I'm going with the person who got a bit more undermined across their premiere, but I still found their premiere pretty impressive, and that is Egypt. And again, I feel like Egypt got pretty solid content here, getting set up to his storyline about how his mom passed away and that he wants to make her proud and that he's here for her and that type of stuff. Again, there's a lot of good stuff there. He also gets set to a relationship with Anthony, talking about how they had this shared background and they seem to be the more serious chefs on the cast, with them being shown studying the menu while the others are goofing off. So I feel like that relationship would be pretty important across the season. And plus, I expect Gordon Ramsay to look at Egypt and Anthony pretty highly. And I even considered putting Egypt at number 1, as I feel like his personal content was a bit more unnecessary, where his confessional about how he relates to Anthony came after Anthony's signature dish, which I found pretty strange there. I feel like they were really showing Egypt when he didn't need to. Though I think there's also a bigger knock to Egypt's edit as well, where he does get the confessional towards the end of the challenge where he talks about how the blue team has his challenge won, but then they lose the challenge. So again, slight knock there. Not enough to have him too low on the list, but I feel like it is at least enough to have him here at number 2, even though I feel like Egypt is someone who I was still pretty impressed by their premiere, and it wouldn't shock me if they become a major character moving forward. But again, I feel like that was just enough to leave them behind at number 2. And now, at number 1, the person I believe is the most likely to win Hell's Kitchen, head chefs only, at this current moment, is Anthony. Now, again, I did consider putting Anthony lower, as he definitely seems like a pretty obvious winner right at the bat, getting tons of personal content, talking about how he loves to push boundaries, and people call him a sleeping beast, and that he gets tons of personal content as well about his grandma passing away and that he wants to make her proud. And we get this connection established between him and Egypt that's all pretty good. And we see them being one of the more serious chefs right at the bat. So again, there's a lot to like here about Anthony. And I feel like Anthony is definitely someone who is going to be seen by the show as someone who is pretty serious, someone who is definitely more motivated to be there, and someone who I expect to do pretty well. Now, again, I did consider putting him lower, as he seemed to be a bit too obvious right at the bat. But I feel like until I see more from other people, and I feel like as we get more trends over how these people are being depicted across the season, I feel like Anthony is definitely the one who checks those boxes for me at this current moment. And while I could definitely see that changing in favor of not wanting their winner to be too obvious, I feel like until I see otherwise, I do decide to have Anthony here at number 1. And there we go. That'll do it for this week's video. If you liked this content, be sure to like and subscribe. Really help out the channel. Now I'll be back again next week to update the Power Rankings again, so you can look forward to that. I'm still covering Survivor 47 as well as Big Brother 26, so you can expect weekly content of those shows. I'm on Patreon and have a YouTube membership, so if you want to consider supporting the channel, you can do so by clicking the link in the description. And you can also join the Discord server by also clicking the link in the description. There's a lot of stuff coming your way. But for now, that is the video. See ya.